we're going to start off and see where you are. Now, kids say in school sometimes they get pop quizzes. So I thought, well, maybe we should have a pop quiz. But it won't be that hard for you, I don't think. What we're going to cover in Matthew chapter 12 today, I'm hoping to cover the first 14 verses. I kind of wish we could go a little bit further, but it's probably too big of a chunk, especially with what we need to cover in order to really see it. Matthew 12, the first 14 verses are really going to center around the Sabbath. And so as you start to think about the Sabbath, so many different things come to mind, and maybe some of them aren't necessarily a full idea of some of them. And so just whenever you think off the top of your head, if someone says to you, thinking about the Old Testament and saying the Sabbath, what do you generally think about the Sabbath? One of the Ten Commandments, Lynn? All right, supposed to stay and rest. Anything else come to mind?
Coupled with rest is there's certain works you're not supposed to do.
All right, certain things you're not supposed to do. All right, holy before God. You start looking at kind of these type of things, and everything that you're saying is right. But there's even a little bit more. If you think, what's really the origin of the Sabbath-like rest? Where did it begin? With God. And you think about in Genesis chapter 2, here is God who has created and made, in terms of to create something out of nothing as well as to form into shape, all these different aspects of this universe that we live in Genesis chapter 1. And then you get to Genesis chapter 2, and it talks about how that God blessed the seventh day. Now, the word Sabbath doesn't show up in the whole book of Genesis. Just know that. It's not necessarily called that yet. Because whenever you see it in Genesis 2, it just talks about, and the seventh day. So just kind of understand that. And it talks about in that God sanctified it, and that's where Lois came up with, made it holy. It's not to be common like the other 6 days, so it's going to be different, going to be special. And it talks about because in this, God rested. And it's not so much that God rested because, boy, he's just worn out from all this creation. It's just the idea of he ceased from doing creation and forming and making. And that's that idea. So then you start going, well, okay, since Sabbath is never mentioned by name in the book of Genesis, does anybody know, all right, here's the first hard question. Does anybody know the first mention of Sabbath in the Old Testament? Don't worry, I'll tell you the answer. Look over at Exodus chapter 16. Exodus chapter 16. Exodus chapter 16, look down at verse 22. So what's the setting? Where are the Israelites at this point? Yep, they're in the wilderness. They've already come out of Egypt by the hand of God. Of course, the Passover being the final aspect of that. All right, we just talked about manna and meat. And so here we are in Exodus chapter 16, verse 22. Look at how it reads. Now on the sixth day they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers for each one. When all the leaders of the congregation came and told Moses, then we're going to kind of leave you on a cliffhanger for a second. When he's talking about bread, this is really working off of the idea of manna. And manna, I think, is one of the more fun titles of food. I think we've all had a little of this in our life, because literally manna means, what is it? You ever been served something at somebody's place and they put something out and you kind of go, manna? What is this? What's in this? I don't even recognize it. It's so covered with cheese on the top that who knows what's underneath here. But you start kind of looking through, and for them it was a frost-like substance, it tasted like, we'll see it later on in verse 31, about it tasted like wafers with honey. So a very sweet taste to it, which is kind of unique. But notice here it is, they would typically gather twice as much manna on the sixth day, which we know of as, the sixth day is Friday. The seventh day is what we would think of as the Sabbath. So he says, when all the leaders of the congregation came and told Moses, verse 23, and he said to them, this is what the Lord meant. Tomorrow is a Sabbath observance. Notice he says, a holy Sabbath to the Lord, the covenant God. Bake what you will bake and boil what you will boil, and all that is left over put aside to be kept until morning. So here's the instruction. It's all tied to manna in terms of the context before here. And so everybody was typically supposed to gather an omer apiece, which is quite a bit, by the way. It's like the equivalent of, I think, like 3 quarts, which makes it sound like you might eat a quart of this stuff a meal, which aren't you glad you don't have to store that up all the time? Then he points out in verse 23, he says, let me tell you about the application, about what's going on here. He says, once again, covenant God, Lord. He says, tomorrow is a Sabbath observance, so Saturday's coming. He says, this is a holy Sabbath, so you realize not supposed to be common like every other day. He says, but today, he says, you bake and you boil whatever you want, everything that's left over, you put it aside, and it'll be kept until morning. Then, verse 24. So they put it aside until morning as Moses had ordered, and it did not become foul, nor was there any worm in it. There's a previous story that some people went out and gathered more than what they should each day, and as a result of it, the next day it was typically spoiled and foul. And you go, I think, well, I'll make an assumption here. Everybody's had an experience where you put the leftovers in the fridge and then you forget about them because somehow they get pushed to the back, and then eventually you go, oh. And you take the lid off and you go, and sometimes if it's in a disposable container, you go, I'm not even going to open that. Just throw it out. But here's the picture for them. So they had this experience of going, you know what, we kept extra before and it didn't turn out well. And now here's Moses saying, look, the Lord said on Friday, the sixth day, you take in twice as much, and this is his command. And they follow his command, and all of a sudden, what happens? It's all just fine, which is kind of something, there should be a little bit of a lesson in there for us of going, sometimes things that typically we expect to go in a difficult direction, when you're going to do it out of honoring the Lord, he can make things that are typical, like expecting it to become foul, going, you know what, no, it'll all be fine, because we're doing it out of reverence to him, out of his commands. So, holy Sabbath. Then, verse 25, Moses said, eat it today, for today is a Sabbath to the Lord. Today you will not find it in the field. He says, don't bother going out there because it won't be there. The manna's not going to be there. So, verse 23 is the first time that you see the word Sabbath show up in the Old Testament, and we're going to riddle off about 3 or 4 of them here in this passage. But you already see it there in verse 25. Verse 26. 6 days you shall gather it, but on the 7th day, the Sabbath, there will be none. And you just imagine, people made these mistakes. They would go out on the Sabbath, at least once, we know of it, and there's nothing there. And you think, that's kind of interesting. It happened exactly the way that God said it would. Then, verse 27. It came about on the 7th day that some of the people went out to gather, but they found none. Oh. They didn't find any. Now, I want you to think about what they're going to have to deal with. They go out, they didn't gather enough. They didn't gather twice as much on Friday. So what do they know they need to do in their mind? We better go out and gather some more. And then all of a sudden, there's not any there. And remember, you couldn't gather more than just your allotted share. So it's not like you had this great reserve. And so now comes this situation where you don't get to eat food on the Sabbath. Why? Because you didn't honor God. Now, do you think they remember the next Friday? You would certainly expect them to. Now, notice what happens. Points it out, verse 28. Then the Lord said to Moses, how long do you refuse to keep my commandments and my instructions? Notice in verse 27 it said, some of the people. But notice, who's the mediator? Moses. So he gets, how long are you going to refuse to keep my commands and my instructions? Verse 29. See, the Lord, the covenant God, has given you the Sabbath. He says, I've given you this rest. He says, therefore he gives you bread for 2 days on the 6th day. Remain every man in his place. Let no man go out of his place on the 7th day. Then verse 30. So the people rested on the 7th day. And you go, here is rest. The idea of the Sabbath was not to be some heavy burden upon the people, was it? It was a statement of saying, if you honor my commands on Friday by gathering in twice as much, what will you find on Saturday? Rest. What would typically become foul and worm infested now is just fine. And you realize, what is God showing to them on a weekly basis? His care for them. And you see him provide for them. And if you take quick note here, Exodus 16, have the 10 Commandments been given yet? No, you know it can't be, because if this is the first time Sabbath is mentioned, you know the 10 Commandments can't have been given yet, because they're going to be given in Exodus chapter 20. So you see these principles in hand of going, I'm giving you rest. And then you start going, why does God want to give them rest? Why is God going to do this miracle every Friday and Saturday to go, there's going to be twice as much for you? Because remember, this is a group of more than 1 million people. How would you feel about being responsible for providing the dietary needs of 1 million people every day? No, thank you. I'd rather have God do it. And to look through all this and go, here's God providing twice as much on Friday so that they can actually rest on Saturday or the Sabbath. And that's exactly what he calls it in verse 23, a holy Sabbath. So this is to be set apart from those other 6 days of the week. Completely different. Now, look over at Exodus chapter 20. So we get to the 10 Commandments that are being given to Moses on Mount Sinai. Look at verse 8. Because now you start to go, okay, so we get the Sabbath off under this old covenant. It was new to them in Exodus 20, but what are we supposed to do on the Sabbath? Is there anything special about this day other than we've already gathered the food, we're provided for, we're taken care of? Then you go Exodus chapter 20, verse 8. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Isn't it interesting? This is exactly how God had introduced it to Moses in chapter 16, right? He says it's a holy Sabbath. He says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. He says, there's a remembrance aspect here. There's got something to be remembered and to be different. Then, verse 9, 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work. And there's what Donna was bringing up. It says, okay, no work here. He says, you or your son or your daughter, your male or your female servant or your cattle or your sojourner who stays with you, who all is included underneath this umbrella of rest? Everybody. This is not like, okay, well, if you have servants or slaves, you can't work, but you can send them out to the fields. No, can't do that. He says, well, okay, just the cattle, we're going to let them do, they're just going to be going in circles out there threshing out wheat. He said, nope, can't do that either. Because somebody would have to set it up. You see how far this goes. And it doesn't matter whether son or daughter, it doesn't matter in terms of male or female servant, cattle, even if there's just a sojourner who's with you. He says, even they rest. Keep on going. Now you come down to So what is this day really about? Verse 11. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. So what are they supposed to remember on the Sabbath? Think about it. What does he say? What are they supposed to? God the Creator. Now think about that. This manna typically does what if you gather more than what you're supposed to on one day? It spoils. It becomes foul. I mean, you could almost maybe walk through a camp on one of those days and go, I know who gathered up too much. I can smell it from their tent. But to go, the remembrance of going, we serve the Creator. He can make manna last for 48 hours if he wants to. But if he wants to set it where it spoils in 24 hours, he can change it back and forth every week. And that's exactly what he did on Friday. What you gathered on Friday would last for 48 hours. But what you gathered on any other day would only last for 24, maybe. I know that hours don't necessarily work out all the way. You don't see any of those kind of things in the Old Testament. Now, that's something that the Jews came up with on their own traditions. And so you don't see those necessarily that link of time. It's funny because in Acts chapter 1, it talks about they went a Sabbath journey to go out to the Mount of Olives. And you go, it's interesting. It doesn't tell you how long it is. It just calls it a Sabbath journey, which is really funny when you get later on. But so you start kind of looking through here to see these aspects. And so what's in place, you go, all right, so they're to remember that God's the Creator. And then later on in the book of Deuteronomy, look at Deuteronomy chapter 5. Deuteronomy is written about a month or two before the children of Israel are going to cross into the promised land. Moses is about to die, but God gives another giving of the law. And what you realize is it hasn't changed, but there's some things that are given in a greater detail, maybe even some extra details. And so Deuteronomy chapter 5, once again, a listing of the 10 commandments. Look down at verse 12. You're going to see something a little bit different here. Observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy, as the Lord your God commanded you. All right, this sounds very similar. Verse 13, 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. Sounds very similar. Verse 14, but the Sabbath day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your male servant or your female servant or your ox or your donkey or any cattle or your sojourner who stays with you, so that your male servant and your female servant may rest as well as you. He says, you get a little bit broader scope in terms of who's described, but it still covers everybody. Then we get a little different. Verse 15. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out of there by a mighty hand and by an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. So what gets added on top of remembering God as the Creator? Remember where you were. You were a slave in Egypt. Number 2, he says, the Lord your God brought you out of there by a mighty hand and by an outstretched arm. Is it worthwhile for us to remember the power and might of God? Does that make a big difference? And then he kind of goes on to say, and look at where he delivered you out of. You came out of Egypt. Now keep in mind, at this point in time, the people have been in the wilderness for 40 years. And some of them who are now alive here at the Deuteronomy's time point were not even alive whenever they came out of Egypt. And so you see this response of going, The Sabbath is about remembering the Lord God as creator, remembering the Lord God as the deliverer, remembering him in his might and his outstretched arm, remembering him as Savior. Do you ever take moments where you literally are not going to do anything? And so often we are such a busy people, but whenever you finally get time and you put the phone on silent, we used to say, take the phone off the hook, and you just sit and think. And you don't have to do any work. And to think that's really what the Sabbath was about. It was not some great weight to bear of, I can't do anything today. I'm stuck until sun finally goes down. Then I can get stuff done. You go, no. It was about, I want to think about what God has done. I want to consider his power and his strength. I don't have to do anything. Food's already taken care of. And to be able to really consider. I remember hearing a wise man talk about reading a book, and he says you get to the end of the chapter and you got like 3/4 of the page is empty. And he says that's the most important part of any chapter. He says that's the part where you actually think about what you read. And you go, so often, nowadays Bibles, like we're going to save pages, so we're going to squeeze everything together. But to really take those moments, to sit down and to rest and to think. And that's what these things really were back under the old covenant. Remember that God's the creator. He can take care of any physical problem you have. Remember that he's the Savior. He took you out of the strongest armied nation that was on the planet for them. He says, and you didn't even have to fight. And they gave you everything you asked for when you left. Do you think about how much control God has? And then to think in terms of put away the to-do list. And so to take these things together, and I'll show you one more aspect, and then we'll really get over to Matthew. Look at Exodus 31, because this is the aspect that gets left out of it so often. Exodus 31. So what if you break the Sabbath? We've already seen what's the origin of the Sabbath-like rest. We've seen where does this really come from in terms of with manna. And did manna last forever? As soon as they come into the promised land, it's gone. They don't need it anymore. He's going to provide from the land. Then, what they're supposed to think about, now, what's the penalty for breaking it? Exodus 31, look at verse 12. The Lord, the covenant God, spoke to Moses, saying, but as for you, speak to the sons of Israel, saying, you shall surely observe my Sabbaths, for this is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I am the Lord who sanctifies you. Oh, now we're really getting down to some things. He says, these are my Sabbaths. Now, I'm going to go ahead and tell you this. Later on, whenever Israel becomes unfaithful to God, they're no longer keeping the Sabbaths, and they're going to be carried off into captivity. Judah as well. It brings it up for both. And then later on, God's going to reveal it to Daniel. How long are they going to, well, he reveals it to Jeremiah first. Daniel reads Jeremiah. And he's told, how long are we going to have to be in captivity? 70 years. And you remember the reason why? 70 years because you didn't keep my Sabbaths. In other words, you're going to pay for what you didn't do. Now, as a worker, I mean, typically it's not for everybody. I know people work in the medical field and people work in different situations where they work odd different hours. But typically in our work week, you work 5 days, you get the weekend, 2 days off. For a slave in Egypt, how many days a week did you work? 7. You ever had a stretch where you had to work 14, 21 days in a row? What did it do to you? Oh. The alarm goes off and you go, again? And you go. All of a sudden you imagine for people who were slaves in Egypt to get out to the wilderness and go, you know what you're going to get now that you're here? Get a day off. I don't want you to do anything. I want you to sit back, realize that God has taken care of your physical needs, the food's there, to understand God's the creator, he stands in control over all these things that you can't touch, and that he delivered you out of the greatest armied nation on the planet. And then somebody goes, we get a lot of work done on the Sabbath, though. I'm used to working 7 days a week. And you start to realize here's God saying, these are my Sabbaths. And this is showing the sign of a relationship between me and you. He says, and specifically here, he says, that you may know that I am the Lord who sanctifies you. I'm the one who set you apart as holy, not you. Because where were they? Slaves in Egypt. They were under bondage. He says, you need to know that I'm the one who took you out of bondage and brought you into where you are now, being fully provided for. No wonder they took a jar of manna and they put it in the Ark of the Covenant. They were to remember God provides. He'll take care of you every day. Not every day is the same, but he takes care of you every day. You come here, he says, all right, you need to know this. Verse 14. He says, therefore you're to observe the Sabbath, for it is holy to you. You notice how holy keeps on showing up? He says, everyone who profanes it shall surely be put to death. For whoever does any work on it, that person shall be cut off from among his people. So how does that sound? Oh, you do work, you're going to get cut off. Now, if you're a note taker, write down Numbers chapter 15, verses 32 through 36. There's a specific story from the wilderness where there is a son of Israel who is out gathering up wood on the Sabbath. And how does it turn out for him? They take him outside of the camp and they stone him to death. They take this serious? Yeah. Why? Because this is God's Sabbath. And it's he who sanctifies us and makes us holy. So we will remember him. And we will remember the Sabbath as holy. Then, verse 15. For 6 days work may be done, but on the seventh day there is a Sabbath of complete rest. Now, I want you to think about that. Is there a difference between a day of rest and a day of complete rest in your mind? There should be. You've experienced the difference. There are days where you go, you know what, we're not putting the throttle all the way to the top. There are other days where you go, you know what, we're not even going to turn it on. We're just going to sit and we're going to think. Time to actually contemplate. Turn off the music, turn off the TV, turn off the phone, and just sit back. That would be our parallel. But notice how he continues on. He says, complete rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath day shall surely be put to death. Surely. Surely God's people will honor him. Then verse 16. So the sons of Israel shall observe the Sabbath to celebrate the Sabbath throughout their generations as a perpetual covenant. Now, there's a word we haven't seen yet. Celebrate. A celebration of God the Creator, God the Deliverer, God the Almighty, God the Provider. Celebrate. So often we think of rest and we go, all right. And you wonder how many kids went, I'm bored. And then mom and dad would say, let me tell you a story about our God. Let me tell you about what he did, what he created. And to consider those kind of things, to celebrate this. Then he says to celebrate the Sabbath throughout their generations as a perpetual covenant. Verse 17 is the part that gets missed so often when people talk about the Sabbath. So pay special attention. It is a sign between me and the sons of Israel forever. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, but on the seventh day he ceased from labor and was refreshed. Now, a couple of things. Number one, in Hebrew, in verse 17 it says forever. In Hebrew, there's like 3 different words that get translated forever. One of them means literally eternal, forever. There's another word that means it's going to happen for a long time and it's going to stop, but I don't really know when, or I'm not going to tell you when. It's kind of like whenever the kids say, how long do I have to wake up in the morning and make up my bed? Forever. Not literally. You know that it's going to stop at some point. They won't be there to sleep anymore. But you realize Hebrew had a different word for that. And there's another word for forever that means it's going to be that way for a long time. It'll outlast you. And there are some principles that are that way. Understand this word for forever is not an eternal word. It's a word that said it's going to happen for a long time, but it's not going to literally never end. So sometimes when you're reading through the Old Testament and you see forever, always take pause and go, what kind of forever is he talking about? Because the Hebrew words will delineate it. But here's the part that gets missed so often in verse 17. It's about a refreshing. What does it take for you to feel refreshed? Think about it. What does it take?
It takes getting to wake up on my own time instead of with an alarm clock.
That's right. Getting to wake up in my own time. I get to sleep in. What else? Water, comfort, food. You think about, you know what? Got time to rest. And now I'm refreshed. I can remember, typically, this is before I was married, get Mondays off of work. And whenever I was a bachelor, I'd use Monday, and it didn't take me long to clean up the house and laundry and stuff. And then the rest of the day would come, and there was nothing that had to be done. And by the time I got to the end of Monday, I was like, I'm ready to go to work. I'm ready to go. And you realize it's a refreshing, right? Now, you see what's at hand here under the Sabbath. And I kind of wanted to paint this long picture to really be able to see what's coming up. But real quickly, before we get things out of joint, look over at Colossians chapter 2. Colossians chapter 2. Just so that we don't get the wrong idea. Look at verses 16 and 17. Therefore, no one is to act as your judge in regard to food or drink or in respect to a festival or a new moon or a Sabbath day. We still under the Sabbath? Nope. That's why you need to know that forever word back there is not literally eternal. And then you notice where he's pointing. He says, things which were a mere shadow of what is to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. The Sabbath was a shadow of who? Of Jesus. Think about the parallels with Jesus. Does Jesus promise if you'll seek first his kingdom and his righteousness that he'll take care of your physical situation? He does. Does Jesus give you deliverance, not out of Egypt, but from under bondage of sin? He does. Was anything created without Jesus? No. You can read through John chapter 1, the first 5 verses, and see that. Does Jesus offer refreshing in the midst of going through all the things of life when you need more strength? He gives it to you. Is Jesus someone to celebrate? He certainly is. Worthy to be praised. And you start looking and seeing these parallels with Jesus and going, is he holy? He's the definition of holiness, isn't he? And you start thinking through, how many ways are we provided for with Jesus? We're provided for physically. We're provided for mentally. We're provided for spiritually. We're provided for eternally. How's that for a rest? Everything's there. Now, does that mean, okay, I just sit here in this chair and everything's going to be taken care of? No. But you realize, here's the fulfillment of all these things in Jesus, in the Sabbath. He is the Lord of the Sabbath. He's the one who grants the refreshing. He's the one who steps in to deliver people out of bondage. Now, you see these pictures of what he lays out. Now, come back to Matthew chapter 12. I know you were wondering, are we ever going to get to Matthew, Carey? Remember, whenever we started this class, you said you wanted to go back to the Old Testament and make sure you saw these things from the Old that he's going to bring out. So we're holding to that. Matthew chapter 12, look at verse 1. He says, at that time Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. Ooh, he's walking on the Sabbath? And his disciples became hungry and began to pick the heads of grain and eat. Now, here they are. And by the way, if you want a little footnote, Deuteronomy 23:25 says that it's okay to walk through your neighbor's field and to pick off the heads of grain. Now, you could not put a sickle to it and reap it. But if you were hungry and you were walking through and the grain's still standing, he says you could pluck off a head and you could actually roll it in your hand and the husks would come off and the grains of wheat would be left and you could pick them up and you could eat them as you went through. It was part of God's way of saying, you know, your crop is really not yours, it's mine. Yes? It is interesting, isn't it? Now, remember, capitalization in Scripture is up to the translator. So whenever you see words that are that way, but by this time, it is kind of it's a statement of, oh, this is the Sabbath. So it's already kind of put in that way, and that's why they capitalize it. And remember, whose Sabbath is it? It's the Lord's. So you can understand the connection there. Good question. So here they are, and Deuteronomy talks about how you could go through your neighbor's field. And if you remember what we were looking at back in Exodus, it talked about some of these things of you have to stay in your tent. But yet, where those details come from is Exodus chapter 16, which is before the what? Before the Ten Commandments, before the Old Covenant ever was established. And remember what those things were all tied around? Manna. And God stopped giving the manna when they entered into the Promised Land. So all those things that are there, you see this picture and going, okay, those aspects go away. But the idea of not working, those things were still continuing forward through the Old Testament, especially when you see Jesus, who just so happens to be living underneath the Old Covenant. I know you're in the New Testament, but remember, Jesus is living under the Old Covenant. So here he is, his disciples, they become hungry, they pick the heads of grain, which is just fine. Verse 2. But when the Pharisees saw this, and you just kind of go, oh no. But when the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, look, your disciples do what is not lawful to do on a Sabbath. He says, you're supposed to be their rabbi and their teacher, and you're letting them break the Sabbath. He says, basically saying, why are you blaspheming God? Verse 3. But he said to them, have you not read what David did when he became hungry? He and his companions? which is really fun. Just go, maybe there's a part of the Old Testament you hadn't read, thought about, maybe? He says, have you not read? He says, Remember David? And what's kind of unique here is it just so happens, what's David's relationship to Jesus? He's one of in his lineage, right? If you go back far enough, Jesus is a direct descendant of David. So he's kind of sharing a story that has a very personal side to it. He says, are you going to condemn David? He says, would you do that? Then he says, have you not read what David did when he became hungry? He and his companions. David is the leader. David as the king. And here's his companions that are with him, those who are fighting together too. He says, are you remembering this? And realize they don't see Jesus as king. The Pharisees certainly don't. But how does God see Jesus? King. You can even look over at John chapter 1. When Nathanael shows up at the end of John chapter 1, he says, Rabbi, he says, teacher, he says, you are the King of Israel. You're the Son of God. Nathanael already knew it. And that was the very beginning of Jesus' ministry. But these highfalutin Pharisees, they don't see it. They don't get to see the glory of God because they don't believe. So he says, have you not read this? What David did when he became hungry, he and his companions, verse 4, how he entered the house of God, talking about the tabernacle. Because remember, in the days of David, the temple hasn't been built yet. That's built by his son Solomon. He says, he entered the house of God, and they ate the consecrated bread. He even ate the holy bread that was in the holy place. He says, now he didn't go into the holy place. If you remember, Abimelech brings it out to him, or Ahimelech came out to him. Then he says, which was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those with him, but for the priests alone. He says, what do you have to say about that? Yeah, David was terrible. He was rotten. No. He just kind of paints them right into the corner and goes, where are you going to step next? Now, here's another aspect of this. If you think about Jesus, and we're not going to look at it. We've already kind of touched on it in the very beginning, back in Matthew chapter 1. There's a couple of priests in the lineage of Jesus as well. Shealtiel, and they're priests while they're under bondage. And it's very specific about their role, and we're not going to take the time to tie all those pieces together at this point. But Jesus is also not only in the lineage of David the king, he's also in the lineage of priests. And it's kind of interesting because it doesn't matter whether you read Luke's genealogy in Luke chapter 3 or whether you look at the one that's in Matthew chapter 1, they both start in terms of with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, going down to David, and then from David they start to kind of splice out, and then they come back around to Shealtiel, and then they go back down and they go into Mary and Joseph. And you realize in the lineage, Jesus even has a tie to Levites. No wonder he can have a relative by the name of John the Baptist whose father is a priest. He's a Levite. So you start seeing some bigger pictures here. And so he says, well, this is just for the priests alone. And it's nothing like having having all the hidden answers right there in your pocket and going, I'm not going to show them to you. I just want you to think about what you're doing. Okay. Verse 5. If you go back to 1 Samuel 21 and read this story, David comes to Ahimelech, the priest at Nob, and he tells him, do you have any food? We're in desperate need. And Ahimelech says, the only bread I have is the consecrated bread. And he says, have your men kept themselves pure? In other words, pure from women. And he says, yeah, we've been that way ever since we started fighting. And he says, okay. And he brings it out and he gives the bread, the consecrated bread, to David and to the others. And there's a man there by the name of Doeg. He's the most vile character in the Old Testament in some ways. But you look at him, and he sees what's going on, and his allegiance is to Saul, who's currently still around and thought of as king, even though David's already been anointed. And so you look at this situation, and Doeg is basically kind of like the one who's the tattletale. Because Saul's like, I can't believe David's still roaming around free. Does anybody not stand for me? And Doeg, in the meeting later on, goes, I know what happened. He was up there with Abimelech, or Ahimelech, up in Nob. And sure enough, Doeg the Edomite goes up and kills 85 priests, including Ahimelech, because of their allegiance to David. Just one event, and what's so unique is Ahimelech knows nothing about this situation that's going on between Saul and David. In Ahimelech's mind, he's like, David is one of your top warriors. Why would I not give it to him? Which makes perfect sense, but they kill him anyway. And you start to see how the Pharisees in Jesus' day are just like Saul and Doeg the Edomite back in the Old Testament. Because what do they want to do with Jesus? They want to do just like what Saul's people want to do to David. And you see this great parallel. And Jesus knows this. It's not as if this is hidden from him. And what he brings up. Yes?
Was it okay then for David to eat that holy bread?
It was.
Because he had been
Consecrated. You see those aspects of what's there. And especially when you go back and look at it, you can see some even special ties about looking at David and what he's been called to do. Then, here it is. The Pharisees are not willing to say anything against David. Then, notice how it continues, verse 5. He says, or have you not read in the law? Ooh, second time. I mean, these Pharisees are supposed to be experts at this. This is kind of like saying to a kindergarten teacher, have you never been able to memorize the alphabet? I mean, it may not be that overwhelming, but at the same time, it's like, you should be really familiar with these things. You should be able to put these things together. But apparently you can't. And there's a reason why. He says, have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple break the Sabbath and are innocent? Oh. Now, we're definitely not going to go chase these down. But to realize there were burnt offerings that had to be offered every day. Saturday was not an exclusion of the Sabbath. Every morning, every evening, there was a burnt offering that was offered for Israel on behalf of the whole nation to God, about total dedication. If a child is born on Friday, then they have to be circumcised when? On the 8th day, which just so happens to be when? The Sabbath. 8 days later, you're on the Sabbath. In order to keep the covenant, the priest's going to have to work? He will. Will he be declared now guilty before God because of doing this work on the Sabbath? No. See, they never took the time to really think about it. This is what accusers do. They only pay attention to the one detail they want to expose, and they forget to look at the whole picture. I can remember a situation, a guy, his job was one where he worked all night long on Saturday night. And he would come into worship, and as you would expect, sometimes he would fall asleep. And then you hear somebody else come along and say, can you believe brother so-and-so comes in here and every Sunday he just falls asleep and I can hear him snoring behind me? And then you tell him, after you've worked for 12 hours, would you have enough dedication to show up and worship the God who provided for you? And they go, oh, I didn't know that. Ever ask any questions? And you realize this is what happens when you just want to look at one tiny aspect and not look at the whole. Because what are the Pharisees great at? Putting on these blinders from the obvious to just see the one thing that they think it matters. Now, notice what else is here. He says, and they're innocent, verse 6, but I say to you that something greater than the temple is here. Who is the something greater? Jesus is. He says, I'm the one who sanctifies. This is one of the things that Jesus is going to point out about the Pharisees. He's going to say, you know what? You talk about how the gold that's given is what is important. He says, what about the temple that makes the gold holy? He says, which one's more important, the gold or the temple that makes it holy? They thought it was the gold, and they were wrong. It's the temple. And now Jesus is telling them, that's another 12, 13 chapters away, but going, look, I'm the one that makes them holy. He says, I'm the temple. Then he goes on here into verse 7. He says, but if you had known what this means, and now he's going to quote from Hosea. He's not letting up on them. He says, if you would have known what this means, if you could have a little bit of understanding, he says, I desire compassion and not a sacrifice. You would have not condemned the innocent. Oh, what was Jesus saying about his disciples? They're innocent. What was he saying about those who were David and his companions? Innocent. He says, what is he saying about the priests who have to serve on the Sabbath? Innocent. You see the same picture all the way through. And notice, what is Jesus giving to his disciples? I'm going to give you food. I'm going to provide. We'll walk through the field. God's already taken care of this. This is his field. And you go, is he going to give refreshing? Oh, yeah. He's refreshing them. And ironically, who is he refreshing on the Sabbath day here? Pharisees, I'm going to give you a chance to rethink about what you're doing. It's time for some refreshing. And whenever we get time to contemplate our lives before Christ, do we ever need time for refreshing? Now, I want you to think about this one. What is really our time for refreshing each week? Isn't this what the supper's about? An examination of self, a time of refreshing to go, you know what, I do need to rethink what I'm doing here. I do need to change my attitude. I do need to change what my actions are, how I see God, and to go, I have been delivered from sin. I have been bought back. I've been given rest in Christ. And Hebrews is going to talk about that. But you see this picture and how it lays it out. And he says, I desire compassion and not a sacrifice. He says, you know what, you Pharisees, you're a bunch of compassionless people. Because your whole point is to try to find something to accuse him with. He says, and you would not have condemned the innocent. And then go ahead, verse 8. He says, for the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. He says, it's mine. It was given for rest. He says, but you won't have it, will you? He says, and you're not resting here, you are. You want to accuse the very God who created you. Oh, they needed some thinking, didn't they? And we do too, to think about some things. All right. Have a great week.